I thought I knew my wife. But the moment I saw her through that hidden camera, everything I believed shattered. I thought I had my life figured out. I thought I understood the woman I married. But one unexpected phone call cracked everything wide open, pulling me into a world of hidden truths, betrayal, and a quiet plan for justice that no one saw coming. Hi, is Colin there? This is Chris Waverly, brother-in-law to Laura Palmer. That's what I said when the line connected. But before I could get anything else out, the call was abruptly cut short. The silence was broken by a piercing scream from my wife, Anna, and the frantic pounding of her fists on the locked door to my office. I sat there frozen, uncertain of my next move, then redialed the home number for Mike and Colleen. As soon as it rang, Mike picked up, his voice tense and sharp with anger. He didn't wait for pleasantries. "If you call again, I'm calling the cops," he snapped. I kept my voice steady. "Mike, I hear you," I said, pausing to collect my thoughts. "But I want you to understand two things. One, I don't care if the police get involved. And two, I will be speaking to your wife. That's happening whether you like it or not. Enjoy your night." Strangely, I didn't feel rattled. Even with Anna still banging on the office door behind me, I leaned back in my chair, let my eyes drift shut, and tried to make sense of everything. I knew I'd have to make a decision before the day was over. Should I call my brother? Would it help or just stir the pot? I couldn't stop thinking about something Anna had said earlier that day. She looked at me in a way she hadn't in years, almost like she was searching for something in my face. "You and I have known each other practically since we were kids," she said. "Why are you only telling me this now?" That question caught me completely off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked her, genuinely confused. She laughed, nudging my shoulder like she used to when we were still dating. "I mean, you never told me how much it meant to you that I went to prom with Danny Klein. He was so painfully shy, if you hadn't pushed me to do it, he probably would have skipped it entirely." Danny Klein. I hadn't thought of that name in years. He was the kind of guy who kept to himself, always had his head buried in books. If I had to guess, he was probably somewhere on the spectrum. He and Anna grew up next door to each other, and she always seemed to take him under her wing. So it didn't surprise me when she offered to be his prom date. She always had a big heart. After graduation, we lost touch. I didn't see her again until 2 years after college. By then, I'd landed a job as a systems engineer for a defense firm. One night, I was out having drinks with my coworkers, and there she was, standing across the bar, laughing with a group of friends. She hadn't changed a bit. We talked for just a few minutes, shared a few laughs, caught up on where life had taken us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just coincidence. That maybe fate had spun things back around for a reason. Even as the night wore on, I found myself glancing over at her. A quiet war was going on in my head. Should I follow her outside when she left? When her group started trickling out, one by one, I watched her standing there alone under the awning, phone in hand, waiting for a ride. I smiled to myself. Maybe I was reading into things too much, but something told me our story wasn't finished yet. Back in the present, Tony's voice jolted me from my thoughts. "You think they'll take the deal this time?" I gave a half-hearted shrug. Hard to say. Still scratching my head about why the last two were rejected. He leaned back and tapped a pen against the table. "You and I have worked side by side for years. Maybe they're just trying to figure out if we're too comfortable. Testing the waters." I let out a soft chuckle. Wouldn't surprise me. I had the same thought earlier. I stretched my arms overhead, trying to push out some of the tension that had settled in my shoulders like a weight. Tony stood and reached for his coat. "What do you say to a drink?" I pulled my notepad from my bag, flipping to the pages I needed. Tempting, but I've still got 30-plus pages of notes to sort through from today's sessions. My head was still buzzing, long negotiations, curveballs thrown our way, and worst of all, something personal unraveling right under my nose. I was so caught up in everything that I didn't even notice someone sitting down beside me until a hand appeared in front of me. "Hi there, I'm Brandon. I manage this Marriott," he said warmly, extending his hand. I gave him a quick shake. "Chris Waverly. I reserved conference room L122 for today." He gave me a nod, then tilted his head thoughtfully. "Just curious, I noticed you were taking pictures of a couple that came in earlier. Friends of yours?" The question hit me like a slap. My stomach dropped. My mind instantly replayed the moment I went up to the 8th floor earlier. I saw her then, Anna's clothes, her posture, the way she moved. It all lined up. My eyes settled on the man's hand, on his hand. There it was. A gold wedding band gleaming under the conference room lights. I let out a hollow laugh. "Nice ring, Mike. Looks like you're just as much a liar as your precious wife." His face went red with anger. He leaned in, eyes narrowed, voice barely more than a growl. You don't know the half of it. Walk away, Chris. I'm warning you. He didn't need to finish his sentence. I knew exactly where that road led. I exhaled slowly. I'm sorry if that hurts, Mike, I said evenly. But that's not really my problem. When I finally got home, Anna was already there, standing in the doorway between the garage and the kitchen. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest, and the look on her face was hard to read. It was like she was waiting, hoping I'd say something that could make all of this go away. Where have you been? What's happening? Anna asked as I stepped past her and into the kitchen, her voice tight with confusion and concern. I didn't answer right away. I placed my laptop bag and files on the kitchen counter, trying to calm the storm still raging in my mind. That's when I noticed something odd. Her phone was sitting on the table, right next to a glass of wine that was only half finished. The way it had been left there didn't feel casual. It felt careless, like someone in a hurry, or someone distracted. A creeping doubt started to settle over me. I picked up the phone without thinking, entered her passcode, same one she'd used for years, and opened her messages. My chest tightened the moment I saw it. She had read the message I'd sent earlier, the one I had hoped might shake the truth loose. I leaned against the archway leading into the dining room and started quietly ticking things off on my fingers. First, I said, my voice flat and controlled, my relationship with your sister will never be the same again. Not after what I found out. Every birthday, every Thanksgiving dinner, every time we gather, I'll be reminded of the lies. Anna's face stiffened, but I wasn't finished. Second, I continued, locking eyes with her, you knew what was going on. You knew exactly what she was doing and you chose to stay silent. So tell me, were you okay with it? Did you think it was acceptable? That's not fair, Chris, she shot back, her voice rising in frustration. I let out a cold laugh. Isn't it though? And while we're having this honest moment, let me bring something else up. You always complain about how Scott's constantly on the road, barely home. But somehow you forget, I travel just as much. At least once every month. So tell me, does that make me suspicious too? She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. It was like she was scrambling internally, trying to find the right answer, the right defense. I pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table across from her. I reached for her wine glass, took a sip, and let the warmth burn its way down my throat. I watched her carefully. The way her eyes darted. The way she braced herself. She was readying for another fight, one we both knew wasn't really about us. Not entirely anyway. I was tired. Not the kind of tired sleep could fix. Bone-deep exhaustion from pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Then, right as she opened her mouth to speak, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, irritated. One glance at the screen and it hit me, like everything that had happened finally snapped into focus. All the chaos. All the lies. And with that one notification, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to believe before. This wasn't my fault. I didn't break this. The next morning my alarm blared at 5 a.m. like clockwork. But instead of heading downstairs to the gym like usual, I took a quick shower, got dressed, and walked straight out the front door. I didn't wake Anna. I didn't say a word. It wasn't about avoiding her, I just had to get to the office. Tony was waiting on me to finalize the memorandum of understanding. Thursday ended up being more chaotic than I expected. Tony and I were on the phone for nearly an hour, hammering out the final terms. By early afternoon, I submitted the document. For most of the day, I managed to stay locked into work. But underneath that focus was a buzzing tension I couldn't shake. I kept circling back to the mess unraveling at home. Scott and I had always been close, Anna's brother practically a friend. And her mother, Beverly? She was sharp, a real power player. Ran one of the most respected real estate franchises in town. Everyone thought Beverly was the one making things happen. But those of us close to the family knew better. It was her husband, Dave, who made the big moves. Beverly may have been the face of the business, but Dave was the brains behind it. Back at the house later that evening, Anna motioned toward the chair next to her. Maybe sit down for a second? I shook my head. I've been sitting all day. That's when Dave's voice cut through the room like a whip. I can't believe you'd think she's capable of something like that. I knew I needed to tread carefully. The last thing I wanted was to push Dave into choosing sides against me. So I made a conscious effort to keep my voice calm, measured. I met his eyes. Then show me I'm wrong, I said plainly. The room fell silent. After a pause I added, that's the issue, Dave. You can't prove Anna didn't betray me. He started to argue, but I stood my ground. For 6 years I never doubted her. Not once. And last night? I finally told her everything. Before I could continue, a voice behind me interrupted. "Man, I bet you didn't expect to see me again." I turned slowly. It took a second to register, but then it clicked. "Mark," I said, my voice low. He gave me a smug grin. "Heard Colleen kicked you to the curb. What's it like being the dad who couldn't keep it together?" I clenched my jaw, trying to stay composed. Across the room, I caught Carl and Josh watching us closely, like they were waiting for something to explode. Mark's grin widened. He was enjoying this too much. But before he could get another word out, I stared straight at him and said, "So what, you think you're the reason for all this?" He chuckled, cocky as ever. "I mean, I had a role to play, didn't I? And in a week," he added, "I'll be out of a job anyway." His words hung in the air like smoke. Then, without thinking, I started laughing. Not because it was funny, because I could see it in his eyes. He thought I was still that guy who'd quietly take the hit. But he was wrong. Now he was the one scrambling. "You know I grew up around here, right?" I asked, smiling just enough to make him uneasy. Mark scoffed. "And what exactly is that supposed to mean to me?" This was growing into something far larger than I initially anticipated, but I wasn't about to rush it. I leaned in just slightly, letting my voice drop. "I know everyone worth knowing in this city, Mark. The power players, the ones who actually move the gears." I let the words sit in the air for a beat, watching his expression for any flicker. When he didn't flinch, I continued, my tone shifting to something colder. "And I also know the shadows. The places respectable people avoid, the things that never make the news. The dirt that people like you pretend doesn't exist." His smirk faded just for a second. "If I were in your shoes," I said, my voice even but pointed, "I'd start thinking about a fresh zip code. Because once this really gets moving, staying here won't be an option." He didn't reply right away. I could see the wheels turning. He was calculating, trying to decide whether I was bluffing. But I wasn't. And he knew it. That night, I met with our legal team to start charting the path forward. We looked into legal action against the insurance firm where Jenny and Mark worked. There was definitely enough smoke, but in the end, we followed our divorce attorney's guidance. Sometimes it's better to wait and strike when the timing's right. We'd been at the bar for over an hour when Sam Malone walked in. You couldn't miss Sam if you tried. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that turned heads as he moved through a room. He owned one of the biggest auto salvage operations in the region and had a daughter, Tricia, who was a year behind me in school. Sam carried himself like a man who was used to getting answers. He made his way through the crowd, nodding to a few familiar faces and exchanging handshakes like a politician. But the moment his eyes landed on me, he zeroed in, his face unreadable. When he stopped at our table, his voice was calm but cut like a knife. "What the hell happened to my daughter?" Before I could form a response, he kept going, his tone darker. "Some guys dragged her under the bleachers behind the old field," he said, low and sharp. "Were you part of that?" I felt the breath leave my chest, but I didn't look away. "No," I said quietly. "I was on the tennis courts when it happened." His eyes didn't soften. "What did they do to her?" I swallowed hard, reliving that awful night. When I found them, they'd already ripped her shirt. One of them was trying to force her shorts off. I took a breath, steadying myself. I pulled them off her. I stopped it. His hands balled into fists, the veins in his forearms rising. But he nodded just once, barely. In the days that followed, the emotional weight settled into my bones. I was running on fumes. One night, I dropped into the corner armchair of my hotel room and just sank. My head fell back, eyes closed, replaying every moment from the last few weeks. That's when the clarity came. Anna had never admitted the affair. Not directly. But I realized she hadn't needed to. My refusal to forgive her sister for what she'd done told Anna everything she needed to know. She was convinced I would walk away if I ever found out about her and Mark. And she wasn't wrong. Still, I sat there wondering, was this really the end? Or had the affair just dragged a truth to the surface I had been too afraid to face? I kept asking myself, would I have handled things differently if Anna had been home that Wednesday night? If we had sat down face to face, could I have been fair? The next morning, before heading into work, I made a quick detour. I drove past Anna's office and confirmed that her car was parked there like always. Once I was sure, I pulled around the back lot and carefully installed a small GPS tracker under the driver's seat. I didn't feel proud. I just needed answers. The rest of my day was spent at home prepping. Equipment, lighting, props, the whole setup. By early afternoon, the house was quiet and ready. At 2 p.m., I lit a fire in the living room. That fireplace had seen so many of our moments. Cold winter evenings spent on the couch, sipping wine, watching the flicker of flames as we talked about our dreams, our worries, our future. Now all of that felt like echoes from a life that no longer existed. I glanced at the bookcase and the empty spot on the top shelf where Anna used to keep her favorite collection. Most of those books were untouched by me, but she treasured them. I could have used anything to stoke the fire, but I didn't want ashes. I wanted answers. As we talked, I got up slowly and took the wine glass from her hand. Then I passed it back to her deliberately, watching closely. Her face shifted. Confusion. Realization. Then anger. One of those books, The Wind Between the Pages, had been a gift from her dad. On the inside, he had written a message that used to make her tear up every time she read it. Now she looked like that memory had turned into something sharp, something that cut instead of comforted. Then a voice, firm and unfamiliar, shattered the moment. "What happened to your face?" I turned just enough to show the bruising on the side of my jaw. "My wife hit me," I replied without flinching. The officer narrowed his eyes. "Why did she hit you?" I kept my tone calm. "She's been under a lot of pressure lately. She's angry, conflicted. I believe she's struggling with the guilt of an affair. She doesn't know I found out. I was planning to serve divorce papers tonight." He looked me over, then exchanged a glance with one of the younger officers, who immediately stepped in, ready to act if necessary. The lead officer turned to Anna, holding out a sealed envelope. "Are you Anna Waverly?" Anna hesitated. Her eyes moved from me to the officers, and then slowly she nodded. Without breaking eye contact, the lead officer extended the envelope toward her with measured clarity. "Anna Waverly, you are hereby served. Enclosed are the divorce papers as well as a temporary restraining order. This order prohibits you from contacting Christopher Waverly, entering his residence, or approaching his place of employment." The room went still, the gravity of those words hanging between us like thick fog. Anna didn't speak, her fists tightened at her sides, her lips pressed into a hard line. Without another word, the officers moved in and placed her in handcuffs. It wasn't dramatic, just deliberate. The sound of metal clicking closed was the only sound in the room. One of the officers gently took the envelope from my hands, skimmed through the documents, then nodded and stepped back. For what felt like an eternity, Steve and I just sat there in complete silence. Nothing needed to be said, because everything was already there, hanging in the air. Pain, regret, confusion, and the quiet ache of things broken beyond repair. Finally, Steve stood. Slow, deliberate. He walked around the table and, without hesitation, pulled me into a firm hug. His grip was strong but tired, like a man carrying more weight than he could ever admit. He let out a long breath beside my ear before stepping back. When he reached the doorway, he stopped and turned to face me one last time. His eyes were tired, his voice softer than before. "Burning those books," he muttered, shaking his head slowly, "that was a low blow." Then, without another word, he stepped outside and closed the door gently behind him. But I knew this wasn't over. The hatred I'd seen in Mark's eyes told me everything I needed to know. He was already plotting. I could feel it, like a storm brewing on the horizon. It wasn't a question of if he'd try something, it was when. And I wasn't about to spend my future glancing over my shoulder. That's why I set this meeting up. Mark entered the room with slow, measured steps. He wasn't in a rush. He wanted to make a point, control, presence, dominance. But I wasn't intimidated. I studied his face, watched for signs of fear behind the swagger. "Anna Marie Carmichael," I said calmly. "From Milford, Connecticut." His jaw twitched slightly, but he gave nothing away. I took another step closer, tone firmer now. "Susan Berg. White Plains, New York." Still no response, but his posture tightened. "Attell." From across the room, she approached the table, her movements smooth, deliberate. Even dressed down in a hoodie, hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, she held herself with an elegance you couldn't fake. She leaned in and kissed my cheek softly before taking the seat across from me. "You nervous?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. I raised an eyebrow at the question, then thought about it for a second. "Not nervous," I admitted. "Just tired. I want this chapter done. I want my life back." Her face changed, something soft passing through it. Then a tear slipped from her eye, sliding quietly down her cheek. "He's blackmailing me," she whispered. "Mark, he's threatening to release a video." I sighed. I already had a feeling that was coming. But then she hesitated again, her eyes wide, searching mine for something. Reassurance, maybe. "You were really faithful that first year of college, right?" she asked suddenly. I shook my head slowly. Her question wasn't the point anymore. "Not really." "Look," I said quietly, "you may not like my answer, but deep down I don't think you ever fully trusted me. Let's be real, there's no trust left in us, not anymore. You twist the truth, you spin things around, and it's exhausting. She tried to pivot. I haven't even seen Mark since all this started, she said, like it was some casual fact she could toss into the conversation and make it go away. I smiled, tight knowing. She caught it and tensed immediately. So, how's Mark's domestic case coming along? She asked, eyeing me carefully, like she was trying to read whether I knew more than she did. It took another 7 months before the divorce was finalized. I made sure the house was sold and Anna got her fair share. Then I packed my things, took a transfer, and moved to a different city, far away from everything she had torn apart. I kept the job. That was the only thing that felt steady. Everything else? I rebuilt it. Scott and I stayed in touch. We'd always been close, but now we were bound by the mess our lives had become. We coped the best way we could, sometimes immaturely. We shared old photos of our exes on social media, not to win sympathy, but to expose them for who they really were. People recognized them. Some even stopped them on the street, said things, made jokes. It wasn't classy, but we didn't care. Dating? Not on my radar. I've poured everything into work. Stability, routine, that's what I need now. Scott stayed in the same city, still riding out the storm in his own way. Steve checks in every so often. He'll call out of the blue, usually at night. We'll talk for a few minutes, small things, life, work, the weather. But underneath it all, we both know those calls are his way of saying, I'm sorry this happened to you. Someone once asked, do you remember the last conference they were both at? Natalie's voice pulled me out of my thoughts. Yeah, I said with a smile. Every time I'm in the kitchen making breakfast for the kids, that weekend comes rushing back. She gave me a look, half amused, half baffled. I still can't believe you had the guts to name your son Jared, she said, shaking her head. Steve, who had overheard from the next room, chuckled. You don't get it, he said with a glint in his eye. That's my boy. I let out a slow breath. Steve couldn't see it, couldn't even begin to see it. There wasn't the slightest resemblance, nothing in Jared's face or mannerisms that connected him to Steve. But somehow Steve had convinced himself of a truth that wasn't there. And I knew no amount of reasoning would change his mind. The air between us grew more uncomfortable by the second. My thoughts drifted, unspooling back 8 years to the weekend that set everything in motion. Natalie, Katie, and a set of plans that unraveled more than just a few days. Would it be okay if we left Friday morning and came back Sunday night? Natalie had asked casually. Yeah, that's fine, I told her. Have fun. She slipped away into the kitchen. I could hear her in the next room, her voice light as she confirmed the details with Katie. If she felt any guilt, if she carried even the slightest remorse for what she had done, she hid it well. That night, I told her I had some leftover reports to finish on my laptop and that I'd be up late. The truth was, I had another task in mind entirely. It didn't take long to find the website for the East Coast Medical Equipment Dealers Conference in Lancaster. A few quick clicks and I had everything I needed. By the time Monday rolled around, someone, either Natalie or the divorce attorney she'd soon be hiring, was going to have a very uncomfortable morning. I cut off every financial tie we shared. Closed our joint checking account, canceled all the credit cards and opened new ones in my name alone. From that point on, Natalie would be locked out of everything. I also made plans to secure the house, change the locks, shut her out of the one place she never thought she'd lose. She'd probably find a way back in eventually, but I was hoping to buy enough time to handle something even more important. Jared. Even if he wasn't mine by blood, Jared had always been my son. I'd raised him, guided him, stood by him through every scraped knee and bedtime story. I wasn't going to abandon him. Not now. My backup plan was simple: my parents. A few years back, they'd moved into a big farmhouse just outside of Lebanon. Too big for 2 people really, but my dad had always wanted a little land. He'd turned that place into something beautiful, rows of vegetables, an orchard, even a few chickens. Jared loved it out there. When I called, they didn't hesitate. Come stay as long as you need, my mom said without missing a beat. My dad had a habit of calling Jared Jake, ever since he was little. Never really got it right. But he loved that boy like his own flesh and blood. One night out on the porch, Jared sat next to me, swinging his feet under the bench. He was quiet for a long time before finally speaking. You're not happy anymore, are you? He asked softly. The question caught me off guard. I looked down at him, stunned by the depth of it. Things haven't been easy, I admitted. I'm not exactly sure what's wrong, but I can feel it. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Mom, she's not being honest. She's seeing someone else. Silence wrapped around us like a blanket. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to question it. But deep down I already knew he was right. Later when we got back inside, Jenny stood near the stairs. She had overheard. She didn't say much, just turned and walked slowly up to her room. Lynn stepped forward, her face pale. "You were right," Jenny whispered over her shoulder, her voice barely audible. I was still trying to piece it all together. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice low, cautious. "I think Lynn should explain the rest," she replied quietly. Lynn approached with hesitant steps. "Should I?" she asked Jenny, almost asking for permission. Jenny gave a slow nod. "He deserves the truth." Lynn took a deep breath before she began. A few days later I made a stop at the office. I scheduled a quick meeting with Mr. Turkett, and Helen, his longtime secretary, let me know he might be free that afternoon. Helen had always been good to me. Polished, efficient, sharp as a tack. There was a kindness behind her professionalism too. I always had the sense she looked out for me more than she let on. When Mr. Turkett finally came out, he greeted me with his usual firm handshake. "Hope you've got some good news," he said with a polite grin. I didn't answer right away. I turned to Helen instead. "Would you mind bringing us a couple coffees? And maybe hold my calls for a bit?" She nodded and disappeared down the hallway without a word. Inside the office, Turkett motioned for me to sit. "All right, Steve. What's on your mind?" Helen returned a few minutes later, setting the coffees down gently. As she stepped away, she gave me a look, one I hadn't seen before. It was brief, but it carried weight. Like she knew something was about to change. She fascinated me, honestly. Tall, elegant in a quiet way. She reminded me of someone who'd walk right into a courtroom or a boardroom and take over without raising her voice. It always surprised me that Floyd had her working as a secretary instead of leading his department. What I didn't know at the time was that she'd asked to transfer into my office 3 separate times. But my current secretary had always refused to leave. As I took a sip of coffee, Helen returned again, this time with a manila envelope in her hand. "You're going to want these," she said, placing 4 blank discs on the table beside me. I raised an eyebrow, unsure what to make of it. "Go through the pending accounts. Especially Stoddard," she said, her voice low. "Make copies. 1 for you, 1 for legal, 1 for your lawyer, and 1 just in case." Her tone left no room for argument. Meanwhile, I had another project to finish, one far more personal. I had positioned cameras throughout the room. No one suspected a thing. Each smoke detector had a hidden lens inside it, and I'd tested the audio 3 times before anyone even walked in. I wasn't just looking for closure. I was building proof. Back in my hotel room, I changed clothes and methodically laid out everything I would need. My equipment had been packed with care: 2 small cameras, my laptop, backup drives, and a notepad full of details. 30 minutes later, right on schedule, the pizza delivery arrived. I tipped the driver, closed the door behind me, and checked the time. It was 3 p.m. Everything was ready. Both cameras were operational, flawlessly capturing crystal clear footage, even with the soft sunlight filtering through the blinds. My laptop was connected to the feed, humming quietly as it recorded every frame. Still, I couldn't shake the restlessness stirring under my skin. A part of me wished I could focus on something else, maybe the confrontation that had been building for months. But I stayed committed to the plan. I stepped out of the room and moved quickly to the stairwell at the far end of the corridor. Peering around the edge of the building, I spotted Natalie and Katie down the hall. They were laughing, their voices echoing lightly like nothing in the world could touch them. A moment later, Jared and Martin emerged from the elevator. Natalie fell in beside them and reached for Jared's hand, pressing a kiss to his cheek in a gesture that twisted something inside me. The 4 of them walked together toward a sleek black sedan parked just outside. I stayed back, just out of view. Then I heard Natalie's voice, playful and laced with something more. "The winner gets the first 3, she called out, her voice ringing with amusement. Martin laughed. "How's that supposed to work with 2 guys?" Natalie's smirk widened, eyes gleaming. "Who said it had to be just guys?" she teased. Katie gave her a look, then the 2 of them burst into wild laughter. In a flash, both women yanked off their shirts and bras, spinning toward the guys with bold, unapologetic smiles. Katie called out, "What's the hold-up, boys?" Martin and Jared paused for just a second, then fumbled at their belts. I didn't wait to see more. My stomach turned as I backed away from the corner. I'd seen enough, more than enough. It didn't even feel real anymore. Somehow, we were all part of this unraveling, tangled mess, and no matter how hard I tried to make sense of it, it kept slipping through my fingers. If he had been paying attention, if he had opened his eyes to what was right in front of him, he would have figured it out long ago. 1 letter. 1 phone call. That's all it would have taken. It wouldn't hurt to send a birthday card once in a while, someone said. Yeah, another voice added. Even just something small. A little reminder so he starts connecting the dots. Katie snorted. I've got 3 kids running around my place and none of them belong to the man paying the bills. And there he sits every night, drowning himself in cheap beer, clueless that half those drinks weren't even poured for him. The air was thick, every word laced with bitterness. It was only a matter of time before Natalie caught wind of the surveillance, and we couldn't afford that. We had to act before she did. We'd arranged a parking spot just outside of Hagerstown for the van, giving us easy access to the highway the next morning. The trip itself had been organized by the women, and to their credit, they'd done a solid job. The only change I made was trimming down some of the travel time. Gas prices were ridiculous, and I wasn't about to waste money on extra detours. Thankfully, I had come prepared with enough cash to cover what we needed. After 3 long days at Disney, we were now headed toward Chattanooga to see the aquarium. Hi Mom, it's Jenny, I heard from the back seat, her voice soft but steady. She was calling to check in, making sure everything at home was still running smoothly. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, our legal efforts were still underway. My parents had agreed to pursue full custody of Jared, or Jake as my dad had taken to calling him. But the biggest roadblock was still looming, getting Natalie to sign off on it. That was Seymour's job. And for the first time in months he looked genuinely anxious. What Natalie didn't realize, though, was that my father had already taken action. Without telling her, he'd filed paperwork to have Jared's legal name changed to Jake Waverly. By the time the dust settled, the girls were already enrolled in a new school in Burlington. They spent the summer enjoying fresh air and a clean slate. Vermont had given them something they hadn't had in a long time: peace. Once they were fully settled, Jake and I made our way back to Pennsylvania. Later that week, I had a follow-up conversation with Mr. Turo. From the look in his eyes and the weight of his voice, I could tell the wheels were finally turning. Pieces that had been floating for months were snapping into place. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like progress.